What would people say about this life I choose? What would people say if I asked them to?
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to People Say, a podcast where I unpack the challenges of launching a career in a creative field. Our next guest is a supremely talented record producer, mixer, and engineer who has spent the last 30 plus years working with some of the most iconic names in music. He began his career as an assistant engineer for the great Trevor Horn and later engineered and produced alongside the likes of Phil Spector, Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, and Steve Lillywhite. He has produced music for Coldplay, U2, Morrissey, Star Sailor, Ed Harcourt, and many others. He has also mixed and engineered records for David Bowie, Patti Smith, Elbow, the Pet Shop Boys, and Seal, just to name a few. And most recently, he produced my debut LP, People Say. It is my great honor to welcome my close friend and collaborator, Danton Supple, to the podcast.
Ben, it's very lovely to be here.
I was wondering if I got that all correct because you have quite the resume.
It's the only thing I would have changed on there is U2, who I had the real fortune to record and mix with, but it was under the amazing production of Mr. Brian Eno.
Ooh, he is pretty amazing. That must have been an exciting.
It was a crazy time, yeah.
Well, we're gonna get into that in a bit, but as I do with all the episodes here, we really want to get this story right from the beginning and how you became this incredibly successful music producer, engineer, mixer that you are today. You were born in London in the UK. Talk to me about what your childhood was like, how it started. I know you moved at some point to Pasadena. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, no, I was born in central London. It's amazing, actually, when you live in London and you ask people where they come from, how few people actually come from London. So being an actual Londoner, I think is part of the reason I've got such a love for the place. But I was only here very briefly as a child. I was born, my father was at University College London here, so I was born at the hospital there. And then very soon after, we moved to Pasadena because my father was an academic and he went to be a postdoctoral researcher at Caltech in the mid-60s. And so within a moment, obviously I didn't remember my London start. I was in California and we lived in Pasadena until my father then moved to University of Oxford over here. And we came back in late 60s. So I think it was a bit of a shock. I mean, it's still an early part of my memory, but I think when you've got used to your formative years, those early formative years, you've been immersed in the blue skies and sunshine of California. Apparently coming to Oxford was a bit of a shock for my childhood self. My mother would say, you can't just look at the rain, look at this itchy woolen jumper and just be like, what is this? When are we going back? But we never did go back. So we were in Oxford for a few years. I guess actually thinking about it, we were following my father's academic career because then he set up a department at the university in Surrey. So we moved to Guildford, which is where I kind of grew up and went to school. The city and in the countryside around it. And it was all very, very pleasant, nice sort of middle-class upbringing in Surrey. I had slightly unconventional schooling in the sense that it was a time when the government was constantly changing the structure of schooling. So they introduced a middle school system, which meant from the age of 10, there was this middle school, but mine was a brand new school they'd built. So I was the top year. And the reason that becomes maybe slightly more formative or guiding in my life is that was the last year in my education that I ever had boys older than me. Because for the 2 years there was no boys because I was the top year as I moved through. And then I went to a girls' grammar school that had started to take in boys. And so there were no boys in the years ahead of me. Speaking to a teacher years later, they said, that was why your year was such a bunch of assholes. Is because there's been you'd never been bullied. There'd never been the kind of the knockdown you get from the older guys. We just had this free reign as boys to grow up without any fear from above. So that's what took me through schooling.
Well, let's hang on there for a second. So I want to unpack a couple of the things that we've said. So we moved to Pasadena. How old were you exactly?
I would have been baby, I was months. Literally, I think I was less than 6 months when we moved.
Gotcha. And then how old were you when you moved back to
I
England?
think I was just coming up to 4. I think it was 3 odd years we were there.
Oh, so you basically had very little recollection of your time.
No, it was just toddler years. And we were coming back, A, for my dad to go to Oxford, but also for school in the UK, I think.
Gotcha. So you're the majority of your childhood, or at least the part that you remember, and your real formative years was spent in Guildford.
Indeed. And in Guildford in the city, which was great, but then in my sort of early mid-teens, we moved out to the countryside. So I'd commute into town for school. It was very, I say countryside, English commuter belt countryside. Everyone who's there, no one was farming, put it that way. Everyone's going into a city job, but it was still beautiful countryside.
I've been to the countryside, and it's a beautiful place, I'm sure, to grow up. I mean, obviously I've only seen it as an adult. So during this time, were you drawn to music? Do you remember this being a part of your life? Were your parents big music fans? They had records in the house?
Oh, they weren't musicians. They were very into music. My mum had been really into trad jazz in the 60s. We'd kind of travel around to all the jazz clubs in London. In fact, I think that's where my parents met, at Eel Pie Island or some, similar jazz club. And they also had a lot of parties. So when we were in Guildford as a kid, I remember the house just being crammed with people on lots of occasions, kind of wiggling your way around between the legs, serving crisps. That'd be my request. So I kind of stay up and watch these fun parties. And the music from them did very much permeate my mindset at the time, and it still is. I think the things that you infuse then, which in our family was like Carole King, Carly Simon, the band, Wings, Leonard Cohen, but especially things like Carly Simon, the album No Secrets, and of course Tapestry. They were kind of on rotation, it seems, for most of the 70s, as far as I can remember at the house. And they set up an interest. Plus, I was just interested myself. My first bit of pocket money, I remember going with my mum to a supermarket and buying an LP for the first time with my own cash.
Do you remember what that was? Which one?
It was something crap. We used to have a series here called, I think it was called Top of the Pops or something like that, which I don't even know if it was the original artists. I think for all the various legal reasons of the era, there were covers of the top 20 that year. So you weren't even getting the best versions. But then you'd find out the things you liked and you could buy similar things. So that was, but at this point I wasn't thinking in a sort of musician way at all. And in fact, looking back, I was trying to work out where did the production desire come from. I couldn't see it at that point in my life because it hadn't been my direction in life. I hadn't been going through education aiming to become a producer. I'd been wanting to do something very different. But music was still a very big part of it.
Can I stop you for a second? So you said you didn't want to become a producer. You wanted to become something else. So was there something when you were a kid that you had some kind of dream that obviously morphed?
Oh yeah, I wanted to be a surgeon. I went through a school doing sciences, which is why I did all maths and science at school and did maths and science at our A-levels over here. But music was always a huge part of it. And as my father had said, when you had stuff, you were always really obsessed with how they sounded. I spent my pocket money on buying a decent hi-fi and different speakers. So I had a kind of cool setup for when I was about 14, when my friends coming around and we'd have, I had a good hi-fi setup. And I'd sit between the speakers and be really kind of obsessed a lot of the time by the sonics. I didn't know what the instruments all were, but I knew that some records sounded different to others and sounded better than others. Beyond just the songs. I mean, obviously fundamentally it's the songs, but there was something about the tonal side. And that was kind of going on in the background whilst I was still plying this course to go a different route. I learned an instrument. I started clarinet, I think, as at 13. So that gave me the kind of the understanding of some more technical side of music now. And guitar. But I think, and also in keeping with probably my character at the time, it was mainly drums that I was playing. So with regards to bands at school, I think it was just playing drums and a few kind of mixed up bands between a few schools, a few friends. basically just playing Bauhaus covers, if I remember rightly. So that was the only thing outside listening to music. But I was very preoccupied with listening to music every night. I remember falling asleep to music and coming back from school and, needle on the record. That was my obsession with different things and seeing how these different records were made. And then occasionally on TV, you would see studios. There'd be a documentary and there'd be a studio. And I always used to think, they look like amazing places. But again, it still wasn't on my radar as a destination. So, but it was there in the background. I think this kind of all shifted completely, by not getting into the med school. My sixth form, which is our sort of last year here, was way too much of a party time. So, I didn't get in first time round. I then went back to improve grades. And in that year, the girlfriend I had at the time, her uncle was part of the radiophonic workshop. It's kind of an institution over here. It was the sort of founders of early synth sounds and audio processing, which did these amazing soundscapes for TV shows. And I got to go and visit him one day, and he was in the studio. And that really was just a penny drop moment when I suddenly thought, actually, this is what I want to do. This is, my obsession with the way things sounded and the fact that here were the tools and the means to actually manipulate these things and to play around with them and to just listen to music all day long as a career. Plus the other sort of artifacts that go along with it. There was quite a decent social life. And I remember being at his studio and we would be at the pub at lunchtime. And there were all these factors, great music, the technology as well, because music had the money to be at the forefront of tech. So you were constantly learning. There's always new tech coming in, which kept it interesting. So then that became that was my moment. Didn't go down particularly well at home, but that was where I decided, at that moment, okay, this is what I want to do. And so how do I do this?
All right, so let's stop right there for a second and unpack that large swath of your life we just covered. So I want to back up a little bit because there's something really interesting about this moment. Obviously, this is like a keystone moment in your life, and I want to really unpack that further. But before we get there, so you mentioned something. You said you wanted to be a surgeon, and I immediately thought when you said that, in a lot of ways you are. You're a sound surgeon. You're a musical surgeon. And so I think maybe some of the technical passion that you had probably still carries over into your music. And so I guess I want to know, what age were you when you started to be obsessed with music, start to be obsessed with sounds, all that stuff you were talking about from your earlier childhood? What age were you during that time? And
I think it started when I was pretty sort of 12, I think 12 or 13, over here where you do a paper round. And as soon as I got money, the first thing I bought was musical stuff. It was, an early home hi-fi records. But also here was the difference. I found myself buying records for their sounds, even if I hated the song. Where, friends would be going, oh my God, there'd be the laughter as they pulled out something from your record collection. And it'd be like, yeah, but you should hear, they're playing these things. I don't even know what they are. And there's a whole sound to the drums in this track. I didn't know about the technology behind drum machines developing, the early drum machines. And how, technology was creeping into the industry, which I was hearing, but not knowing what it was. I was hearing those changes, but not really understanding the processes. But that's kind of what money went on in those days, was improvements to hi-fi and records and cassettes. Tons of cassettes, because that was a slightly cheaper option.
So, and now let's bring it back to this keystone moment that we were just talking about. Unpack that a bit more for me, because that's a super interest. Obviously, the defining moment maybe of your life, perhaps, where you decided to take a different path.
Yeah, well, at the time, it was just suddenly realizing what studios were all about. I'd seen them on TV. I had this obsession with the sonics, the process, but also it was the tech. Because I kind of did like the attention to detail and the kind of math side of stuff. The sort of the physics and math side of life, I like. It's, I was trying to describe something, moving when you've had that direction in your life to go to a creative industry, which is so subjective. There's no equal signs. And I actually found that quite hard, I think, in my first few years. It was like, people have an opinion on it. There's no right or wrong as such in a general way. And of course, in science, it's all about, or most of the time, there's a right or wrong way of doing things. So that was quite a change as a mindset. But then first thing I was trying to find out was, well, how do I do this for a job? You know, the route into those places at the BBC was very technical. And you probably had to have a music A-level or a music O-level over here, which I didn't have. I couldn't do, there was only one tech course you could do at university, which was called the Tonmeister course, which was fine for the sciences because for the A-levels I had maths and physics as part of their requirements, but you also had to be a grade 8 musician, which I wasn't. So that took that out of the equation. And there were no music tech courses. I know now we're awash. There was no music tech courses or any kind of studio courses available at uni. And as I looked more into it, I realized the only way you got into this industry was to get into a studio and then just learn and watch and move up. And, you know, it was very much a meritocracy in the sense that there wasn't just a progression because of your age or you've passed another exam, which is, okay, meritocracy in its sense. But, you know, you went in there and if you worked hard and you were better at certain things, then you could jump up pretty quick. But once I got into it, I also realized how many people were doing it, how many studios there were at the time. And, you know, I applied to, I think, every London studio. I've got a folder somewhere in the house with all my rejection letters. Because very pleasantly in those days, they used to write you a letter. I mean, nowadays, it's impossible. They can't even answer an email because they get 4,500 applications a week from kids coming out of tech courses. And the number of studios has been decimated. So it was very much the other way around then. There were no formal courses and there were thousands of studios. So it might sound like it was easier to get in. It still wasn't because a lot of people wanted to do it. So I started by getting into I thought, what I need to do is just get in any studio and then I'm through the door into the system. And then I can move around from within rather than just trying to get into the top end places. And that, in fact, did work out exactly. I got a job in a studio in the East End in Hoxton Square, which was just so far from the kind of upmarket, trendy place it is nowadays. I mean, it was a dump. Quite a few people have said, oh, why didn't you buy a place there if you were there? And it's like, because it was a shithole. I mean, there was nothing to do. But I got into a studio there. And then, of course, in studios, you have freelance engineers and producers who are moving around between places. And if you're this assistant that's clearly working hard, making an effort, showing an interest, not being a jerk, then there is the opportunity to move on. And then that's what happened. A new studio, Strong Room, was starting up. And I worked with one of the owners. He was in a band called Magazine, which I was a huge fan of. It was the first time, actually, I think, I've been in the studio with a band who I'd been a fan of beforehand. That was another moment. You know, it was one of those. I've been very fortunate since to have that, but that was the first time. And then he said, well, do you want to come and work at this new studio that we're starting? And so the kind of chain went. I went to their Strong Room. And then when I was at Strong Room, an engineer producer from Psalm Studios, which was Trevor Horn's company, came in and said, look, you're working really hard. The place you need to be is Psalm. And, you know, I knew that, but it wasn't as easy. I'd been rejected from Psalm. I had my rejection letter. And he said, well, you know, as we know, it's much more about just getting through the door, having a chat. So he then organized an interview for me to go to Psalm, an intimidating day, I remember. It also coincided with me going from having long hair to short hair. So I remember arriving at this interview just very conscious of my ears. But I had an interview there with the very long-serving studio manager, Lola Widener, who, you know, it was a notorious place, Psalm, because it had just all the top-end stuff going on. It had amazing studios, but it was also notorious for being a very hard place to stay at. You know, they had a high turnover of staff. Very, what's the word I'm looking for here? I mean, they're very unforgiving in lots of ways. You could be any mistakes and you're gone. So it set a very high bar for the workload there. You also had to start as night reception. They had this rule. So no matter where you were coming into the company, you had to work on night reception. So when I did night reception, I had a former naval officer on there with me and an engineer from a mining company. Who both decided they wanted to work in this industry, but they had to come in there. So it led to a very interesting crowd of people. I mean, there's a lot of people we know now in the industry who came through that same route.
So let's pause for a second there because there's tons to unpack here. And one of the things it's a fascinating story. And one of the things I'm most interested in is you had signaled earlier that once you told your parents that maybe you weren't going to go to medical school and instead you were going to pursue this very confusing, unclear path as a musical engineer, what was the story like in your household? What were your parents saying? Were they supportive? Did they think you were nuts?
I think it's, as parents, it's just concern. I mean, the medical school decision was made for me by not getting the grade. But then the assumption that you just do something else at university, I think that's where they got worried. And I kind of understood that. But also, I've been so interested in that, the idea of doing just anything else for the sake of it, didn't really, fill me with joy. Also, my father was an academic; he was a professor. So, I think for him it was harder still that, I was the only person without a degree. I would have been. You often hear about the kids saying, "Oh, they're the first person with a degree to go to with a degree in their family." For me, it was the other way around. So, I think there was a bit of fear then, and then when they realised I wasn't going to do that, I got the calls saying, "Hey, so and so." It's said that you could join them in the city, as a foreign exchange trader or basically on the trading floors. And it's like, no, this isn't why I'm doing this. I've now made the decision to do this. I think part of this fear, by the way, is because of the terrible pay in the music industry. I was getting offered these jobs, which even in those days were good money. And yet I was choosing to work in a job which was £1 an hour in Hoxton, which meant I had to do like 70 hours to cover paying the rent per week. It was crazy.
So wait, I think this is incredibly important. This moment right here, you got tremendous pushback from your parents. They seemed incredibly concerned, and you, as a kid with very little life experience, made the conscious choice to pick the job that paid £1 an hour when there were so many alternatives at your feet, and you still had the wherewithal to do it. How?
But it did. There was times, trust me, the first sort of 6 months to a year in of working in this kind of sort of not bottom end. It was a really interesting studio. It was a jazz studio, but there were moments where I did have to think to myself, "What the fuck am I doing? This is crazy." There's just no money here, and we're just the hours were just lunacy. I was never home before midnight. Your social crowd, was saying, "What are you doing?" Even your friends are like, "What are you doing? You're never out, never at parties." So, and as parents, I think you just worry. I think, I have kids myself now, and having them pass into something which is fairly safe and secure as their careers does help settle our minds. I think I'd have been open to them being more a bit, being adventurous in the sense of going an alternative route. They've been, adventurous in what they've done, but I think, and also just having to share and live in crap accommodation in London. I think my parents just thought I'd gone a bit nuts, to be honest. I'm not sure what. I mean, years later, it kind of comes and all makes sense to them. So I think, with a lot of things, if you put the right effort in and have the right amount of luck, you're going to get something from it. But at the time, it was definitely it was quite a commitment, I think.
So I want to unpack a bit. When you obviously did have some of these fears, which I think a lot of people had, and was there something specific that made you keep going? Like what made you persevere down this path when, everybody around you was like, "What are you doing, man?"
I think I was just having too much fun. Also, it felt like the right place for me. I said it ticked these boxes. I had a job that involved listening to music all day long. But not only that, I think when I actually saw how records were made, where, because as far as my grandma was concerned, you put a microphone up in the room, everyone comes in, plays the song, fucks off home, record done. And suddenly realizing the complexities was so much more. It was a real eye-opener for me. And it just drew me in further and further, repeating things, being able to go between versions to get these superb performances. The way the equipment processed the sound, I didn't understand. I was watching from the sidelines. I didn't come in here with an understanding of the industry. You had to look and learn. And so I think it was that spending so much time in a sort of slight sense of awe as well, and also being able to see incredible musicians all the time. So that's what kept me going. I mean, it was just the best place to be. I wasn't I think I was doubting whether it would be something that I could survive on, not in, on, with the terrible pay, etc. But I can't really remember any bad days. I remember having some insane sessions. When you're at that part of the market where all kinds of people are coming into the studio. I mean, it's great because, and I say this to people when they complain about certain sessions they're on, you learn from absolutely every session you ever do. I'd have we'd have a lot of jazzers in there, and there was a lot of amazing West African jazz bands that would be in, but the sessions would be just crazy. I mean, it'd just be just on the keeping control of the session and, making sure the building didn't burn down was, half of the task. But incredible instruments, incredible players. So, yeah, that's what kept me going.
Amazing. So let's just recap your story quickly to get everyone up to speed in a couple sentences. So we grew up in Guildford and then moved out to surrounding London country area where you grew up and wanted to be a surgeon, but that didn't end up working out for you. But throughout this whole time, you had this passion for the sonics, the sound of music, and you got a job at a studio at Strong Room, which is where we recorded some of the record we made together, which is a cool side note.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
And then we get to SARM with Trevor Horn, and correct me if I'm wrong, this seems like the real origin of your career, where you really start to blossom.
That was definitely the launch pad, because here was somewhere where I realized that with the work, there were opportunities here. You had the right people coming in. You couldn't really get a better education in the sense that every session that came in with incredible engineers and incredible producers. Oh yeah, this is another thing. At this point, I was looking at just wanting to be a good engineer. Engineering, which is a very different thing now. I think in the form it was for a lot of the time I was working, was quite a different thing. It was a much more detailed part of the profession. In the days when the profession was a bit more sort of delineated between producers and engineers and assistants, programmers, whereas now we kind of do all of those things, mainly because there's less money, I guess. But I felt that this was a place to be. The people who were there were at the top of their game. So I felt by learning from them, seeing what they do, you had the opportunity to do something. And I had some great people to work behind, engineers and producers. Julian Mendelsohn was a big mixer at the time. I mean, literally every week was just a chart act. I mean, the studio was incredible because studios tend to be quite sort of genre specific a lot of the time nowadays. It'd be a band studio or an R&B studio or a pop studio, whereas SARM would just be the most incredible acts coming in. You could have a week where you'd have Madonna in one studio, Pet Shop Boys in another, and Queen in the other. I mean, it was just, and they'd do big albums. So you'd have Queen in there for several months. And George Michael, I mean, I think we did actually have that overlap of George Michael in Studio 2, Queen in Studio 1. I can't remember who was in Studio 4, but it would have been someone of interest. And every evening, everyone would come downstairs and have dinner together in this long sort of corridor and kitchen, cooked by this amazing chef, Lucky Gordon, a man with his own history outside of chefing, very famous outside of chefing. But so it was a really great atmosphere. Every evening at 6:00 were these dinners, and you could have all kinds of incredible people there. I mean, the list of artists that were at SARM whilst I was there for three and a half years I was there was amazing. And also just get these engineers who were just doing things I hadn't seen people do before. So, you can imagine, it's just, you can't stop learning. You're like a sponge the whole time you're there. You're doing crazy, crazy hours. I mean, I look back, I think I was like 9 and a bit stone when I was in my 20s. I was be at SARM from 10 till 2 in the morning, nearly every day. Maybe a Sunday off. Sundays off, I think we did. But and when I was with Trevor Horn and Steve Lipson, we were doing, because as the assistant, you had so much to get ready in the morning. This was the days of tape machines. So you didn't just rock in 5 minutes beforehand, turn on the Mac like assistants have to nowadays. I mean, that's not me putting them down. It's just saying that they didn't have to do the crap of lining up tape machines, which you had to do every morning at SARM. Line up 2 24-track tape machines, all the half-inch machines. It had to be ready that if someone said, right, we're in record, everything was technically perfect. And so, I mean, it was just that the first hour of the morning, sitting there listening to test tones and lining up tape machines with fiddly little screwdrivers. Actually, I do remember having a thought once when I was sitting there with these little particular screwdrivers you had and a particularly fiddly little screw, and it was driving me mad where I was doing my best not to smash it all up. That maybe I hadn't been suited to surgery anyhow, because not being happy with little fiddly intricacies. But again, it was just great. Lots of different bands, lots of great engineers and producers. And Trevor, who was the main person there, who'd done done albums that I'd been absolutely inspired by. I then tried to become his assistant and was lucky enough to become one of the main assistants for him. So I spent a long time with himself and Steve Lipson, who was at the time his engineer.
So let's just back up for 1 second, because a lot of our listeners may be familiar with Trevor Horn, but might not know it. So just for anybody listening, Trevor Horn was in the Bugles, and he sang the song "Video Killed the Radio Star."
Yeah, the very first song played on MTV. The Bugles is the best pronunciation of that I've ever heard. In fact, no, it was Buggles. It was 2 G's.
It shows you what I know.
But the Bugles is brilliant for many reasons. So he was in there, but he also he produced Yes and was in Yes for a while. I'd done these huge productions with Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And see, I was still at school at that point. I was at sixth form, so I was studying my A-levels. And I remember when Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood came out. And I can't remember where I first heard it, but I do remember just being brought to, I was stationary, listening to it going, what the fuck is this record? It sounds amazing. It sounds so different to everything else that's going on. I didn't know the tech behind the scenes at the time. It was the era of Synclavier and Fairchild, the early, high-end processors and sequencers. But it just sounded ridiculous to me. It sounded so incredible. And then he went on to produce Grace Jones' Slave to the Rhythm, which again is a sonically incredible record. Very much credit to Steve Lipson as well, who was part of that team. So then to suddenly end up being in a studio, sitting behind Trevor, watching these sessions going on, I then felt like, okay, I've arrived. This is the start. It's not like I've nailed it yet, but this is a good start. This is a good place to be at this point.
And so how many years, what years are we talking that you worked at SARM? Like you're in your 20s? But
86 to 90.
And how old were you?
21 to 25. SARM, which was quite old actually, because I said quite old. There were those that came in their teens, straight from, you could leave school at 16, I think. So I think they came in then. But there were also a lot of older people who'd come in from another career. They'd had this thing where, their moment in time where they decided this is what they want to do. So yes, 21. I felt that I was older than some of the others, but still felt young enough that there was plenty of time to get on with it. I mean, retrospectively, it's just ridiculously young. That was basically my life. SARM was my life for that period of time, because all you really did outside of SARM was sleep. And you kind of ended up, there was a lot of assistants. There were about 7 or 8 assistants for the, 5 studios? Because the turnover was so fast and there was so much work to be done. So that became the social crowd. It was incredibly competitive, but also lots of fun. They were very close friends as well, because you all lived together. That's the only people you saw. Basically all walking around in a zombie-like state because they had had no sleep, or jittery with coffee, because that became another one of the things at SARM was this, because it was competitive on every level. Even making coffee became competitive. So everyone was always pretty whacked out on too much coffee beans. And then also we ended up living together because it made sense, you shared places. And so your life really did become SARM when you were there.
It's really bonkers to me to be in a studio and think that at the same time, Queen, George Michael, Madonna, Bono, what was that like for you? It must have been insane.
It was insane. You kind of, I guess it did get you used to, I eventually left SARM. Trevor had said to me, there's nothing you can't do now. You've been at SARM and you've worked with me and Steve. And they could be terrible. I mean, half the reason I got the gig is because I wasn't traumatized by them. which sounds odd. It had something of an old public school feel to it, and the sort of fagging and beating of these juniors. I mean, it was a real case of tormenting people almost, to see how close people could get to being to the edge of, what they could deal with and still get through the work, get through the creative and technical responsibilities they had. So, but I kind of dealt with that in a certain way with Trevor, I think, and it appealed to him that I could just kind of get on with it. So, ended up being with him for a long period of time whilst I was there, which meant some really fun albums, because albums were done in their entirety in one place in those days. You'd get in there, you'd be there for 3 months on a major artist, going through the whole process. So it was, as a learning experience, it was great. And, they were true in the sense that when I came out, there's nothing, actually, with the exception of working with U2, which is just the best fun ever, but also just the workload and being able to keep on top of it. I think Trevor did basically set a level which was great. Once you pass that, everything else is going to feel fairly reasonable in comparison. I mean, it'd be crazy. You come in, you'd be finishing work at 2 a.m, and Trevor would say, I wonder if it's this room. Maybe we should go down to Studio 2 for tomorrow. Okay, nice. Well, sounds like a fairly innocuous sentence. That meant I'd be there until tomorrow because I had to move all the equipment from studio, whichever one we were in, to Studio 2, reset it all up, all the patching and plugging, then compare the mixes to get them to sound similar. And then by that point, he'd walk back in the door. It'd be daytime again. Oh, fuck, I haven't got home last night. Where he'd then be, no, it wasn't the room. Let's go back upstairs. It'd be like, oh my God, you're joking. Try not to actually cry half the time was a big part of being there. So,
well, that's a testament to your perseverance, determination, willpower that you could withstand that. Because I don't know anybody in this industry that does quite that level of intense, insane work. I know a lot of people work hard, but it
is crazy. And looking back on it, I mean, when I see the people in our industry now, I remember them at Psalm, and everyone looked on the edge at Psalm because they were so tired. We had people just dropping at times, literally dropping and being injured by collapsing because they were so tired. And coming out, even when you swap sessions and you finished a session, but there'd be a different artist coming, and because it was the last night of your previous session, of course, the assholes work all night. I am the asshole now, of course, but you work all night because you don't squeeze that last bit of your session out. But if the next session has requested you to be the assistant, then you're going to have to do that. So literally you wave goodbye and then shake someone else's hand in a delirious state as they arrive to come into work. And my worst week at Psalm for hours was my last week there, where I didn't leave. I was there, got there on Monday morning, and I was there till the end of the week. And I remember literally being delirious. I was so tired. I remember Trevor asking me to kind of hang in there because I was the continuity between different people he had coming in. That was it for me. I was fried after that one.
That sounds like quite the experience you had, and one that obviously prepared you for your career afterward. I'm wondering if there was some kind of defining moment or something that you can remember where you thought to yourself, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Like, I know for sure that this is it for me.
I don't think I ever questioned not doing it. I felt very sort of vested by a certain point already at that, I was 5 years into making that first decision, that first visit to a studio. So, and I'm not really somebody who's very good at saying, it didn't work out, move on to something else. I tend to keep going, wanting to wring something into life. There really is no other option for me. And this is an amazing industry because there are lots of options. There's lots of things you can do. And even though I was getting to a point there where I'd had a really good education at Psalm, and I don't think that moment came really until I was eventually freelance, and I was busy, and I thought, okay, I'm busy now. I'm rolling from session to session. This is working as a career, and I'm loving it more and more. So I didn't really think, okay, I'm out of that, or this isn't the thing at any point, I don't think. There were times when I was just so tired where I thought, what am I doing? But never, there'd always be something that would happen the next day where you thought, this is just such a great job.
So what happened when you decided to move out of SARM and start working with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley?
Well, again, like some of these, the big moves you need in your life, they're not always voluntary. I was fired from SARM.
Oh, wow.
after that long week, and the person who ran it, Lola, who was this amazing studio manager, really ran this huge, fast-moving ship. But I was just so tired, and I can't remember what was said to me. Something was said to me, and I was just, fuck off. And it was like, what? You can't say that, senior management. And I was like, I'm too tired, fuck off. And I remember walking downstairs to the kitchen hearing, "You're fired," ringing in the background, and thinking, no, I'm not. And going to see Trevor and saying, "Trevor, I've been fired, could you sort it out?" And then for various reasons, he couldn't sort it out. It was quite a complex setup, and I had been in trouble before for something, I can't remember what. I think it was normally talking back or saying something to a senior manager. But so I got fired, which was like a massive wake-up call, because part of the problem is if you're a good assistant there, Trevor, you'll be kept as an assistant for a long time because you facilitate those sessions, you make them work well, you run the ship, and so I almost needed that push to step up and go, actually, I need to crack on here. I need to become an engineer, freelancer. I was more interested in production by that point. So, but luckily on the day, because Psalm was such a well-known studio, on the day I was fired, I called two other of my favorite studios, and they both gave me a job, actually both for more pay, and then both offered me a holiday before I started because they knew I was frazzled from Psalm. So that was great. And I actually chose to work with Alan and Clive because I really loved what they were doing. I'd had a very techie training at Psalm. It was all high-end, front-end technology, great pop acts. And Alan Winstanley was one of the great recording engineers. They work as a production team, but Alan was very much the engineer. And they were recording live bands the whole time, as in a band with a drum kit set up and guitars and acoustic instruments. And so for me, that was hugely appealing because I hadn't really recorded that many drums at Psalm. I mean, there'd been drum kits, but it wasn't like a regular thing. And so being with them, we had drum kits every day. So it was another whole load of stuff to learn. I think actually that's a recurring thing that will come back to why I'm still here, is this business never stops learning. I don't think I would be content in something where you'd kind of learnt the ropes and then it was plain sailing moving on. I would definitely get bored. Now after 35 years, I'll still walk into a session and be like, what the fuck, what are you doing? What's that? And just tell me what you've done. I've no idea, and people, especially if it's a junior in the room or an assistant, will almost be like, oh, panic. But it's like, no, it sounds amazing. Just tell me how you've done it. Because there's so many ways to get from A to B in this business, and a lot of interesting ways of doing it where sometimes people's inexperience makes them do the most amazing things.
Interesting.
So anyhow, I'm then with Alan and Clive and just doing band after band. So my drum recording skills, etc., ramped up. And as is the way with our industry, it goes through different flavors. We had it'd be electro period, and then it'll be back to bands for a bit, then it'll be pop and R&B, and then you have another little band, part of this kind of sine wave of different genres that rolls through the industry. And at the time, actually, it was nearly all pop, so being good at recording live stuff wasn't a huge help. But then luckily it came back round, and I could record stuff well. And so I started getting quite a few sessions, with bands.
So you left SARM and you were like 25, 26, right?
Yeah.
And started to work with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley. And
still assisting them a lot of the time rather than being a full engineer. I was being quite slow in my process of stepping out of the assisting side. I really felt that it was something you could jump out of too early. And I had seen that happen. People were like, I know how to do this. I'm going to go off into the engineering world. And various things about that. One is, you're then having to work and earn in a different way, which changes your focus. But also you step out of a learning environment in the sense that it's all down to you then. Engineers and producers I know who started from a very small part of assisting straight into doing it themselves. Their thing might be brilliant and they've had success with that. But when I have conversations with these guys at, you're having dinner or whatever, they really feel they missed out on seeing how other people do things. And I was very fortunate to see a lot of really great people do things. And all of those, you kind of sap little bits from all of them, and they all go into that memory bank. And a big part of it is not when things are going right, it's when things are maybe a bit tricky on a session. You've got a big folder of stuff to reach into to get yourself out of things or to find an alternative way of going about the recording, because you've seen many good people go about it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I do think it's very easy to get trapped inside your own habits. Even in my own career, I've learned a lot from watching people, and I almost always include that in my writing or my production. So I just took, for the listeners, what type of acts were we working with, with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley? Because obviously you're coming from an environment which you're Queen's there, Madonna, George Michael, these crazy heavy hitters. Was it a similar cast of characters with them?
It was a different because that was the one studio. See, Psalm was 4 or 5 studios with different people producers, so you'd have a whole mix of people in there. Alan and Clive owned the studios where I worked, and so with those guys, it was the music they were known for, and they did. That was what came through there. So it was maybe a slightly narrower bandwidth regarding genre, but it was all very interesting stuff. Again, it was much more acoustic. We had Elvis Costello would be in there for a while. That was amazing. There was a real era of certain bands coming through such great labels as Heavenly in those days. Bands like the Rocking Birds, Flowered Up, all these incredibly energetic young bands coming through, and they were doing those. I'm trying to think what other sort of main acts we did. We did Tim Finn. He's the brother of the guy from Crowded House, who had a very he was part of a band called Split Ends, which was like a formative post-punk new wave band in Australia. And I'm trying to think who else we had in there. Morrissey was a big fan. It was the first time I met Morrissey, actually. I wasn't working with Steve, because I did several albums later. The first time I met Morrissey was with Clive and Susie Sue, from Susie and the Banshees. We had Bowie in, of course. We had Bowie and Eno. That's where I met Brian Eno for the first time, was at that studio, West Side. And we had a lot of great people in there. You'd have Herbie Flowers, the guy who played bass on, Perfect Day and things like that.
It's just crazy to hear these swath of just absolute icons that you're in and around every day for basically the majority of your 20s, which is just crazy. I mean, Elvis Costello, Morrissey, U2. I mean,
it was crazy. We had Lou Reed in there with Laurie Anderson, and it was one of those things where you're so involved in the work. Your head's down, you got your purpose for the day, you're doing your thing, and but occasionally you do find yourself. It's not like you get totally, bland to it. I'd find myself halfway through someone speaking to me going, oh my God, it's whoever that is, and having to try and, I had a few moments there which were just surreal, but you look back on it. But once at Westway, having to go and get some Chinese food, because I was still the bottom end of the engineering rung, and asking around, and Lou Reed was in the studio. He said, I can't make up my mind. I just come there with you and have a look. And then driving down Westbourne Grove in my knackered Golf, which I really wish I'd cleaned because it's like an ashtray inside, with Lou Reed next to you. It was so bizarre.
That is crazy.
But I mean, you'd have that with various artists there. There'd be really interesting. With Sinead O'Connor was in there quite a bit for different things. So, I mean, it was just a very interesting place to be, even if you weren't on the sessions. Again, there was this thing of having dinners, which I don't see in studios so much now, because I guess the multi-room studios don't really exist so much now. But we had, again, a dining area there. One of the upsides is when I left Psalm, the chef from Psalm came with me, which was brilliant. So we had her there.
So my question is, now that you obviously kind of made your way in the industry and you were in the system and working hard, probably making not that much, were your parents a little chiller at this point?
Well, I think so. I think they knew by that point that it wasn't like an overnight game plan. There was clearly a structure to this desire to do this for a job. I think by that point, so you were salaried maybe. I think because I didn't really know much about the profession when I came into it. I came into it without thinking of the money. I mean, I actually know people who came in there thought, it's the music business, I'm going to make money. And so they're probably a bit let down, but that had never been part of my focus. It really hadn't. I didn't actually realize you could make decent money in this game until I was already in it and saw people. I was like, oh, okay, there's definitely money around. But I think I was sort of stable and in it by that point. This is what I was doing. I was an engineer. I'd learned, a craft of sorts up to my experience at that point. And the only thing that changes then is when you cut the umbilical cord and go freelance.
So I want to get into that, and I want to unpack that for a second, but I think there's an important thing to note here, and I find it incredibly inspiring, is that what you just said, which is that you do this for the love of the game rather than the money, and that speaks through your work. And even having had the pleasure of working with you, it's obvious that you're enjoying the journey and the process, and that's why you do your best work. And I find that the people who have that attitude not only get the farthest, but their work is the most genuine because they're doing it because they love the act of doing it. And that's, to me, one of the most inspiring things and what I aspire to.
I think and it's certainly not, doesn't just apply to this, but, through your life you meet people, but people whose sole aim has been to make money or to have fame, when they've been the objectives, it rarely happens. As people who tend to be the people we look at as, the artists we adore and love, they were going to do that no matter what. I've had the question to me in the past of, what do I need to play to be famous? What kind of music should I do? And I just don't understand that at all. It's like, no, just do what you really believe in and do it really fucking well. And then these things just follow on from that. It's like, if you just try and do what you do really well and work hard, then, if the money follows that. It's like when people say, I want to be happy. It's like, no, happy's a byproduct of other things. You have to do those things with sort of devotion and some effort, and then all those things fall into place. And I think if you do just aim for money or fame, you're going to feel very unfulfilled, even if you do manage to obtain them.
Yeah, agreed. It reminds me of that Bill Withers song on Still Bill. Do it good. Great tune. Anyway, okay, getting back to the story. So let's just, again, recap. You grow up in London or in and around London, and you eventually start working at SARM, which is the beginning of your career. Get absolutely pummeled with work there, but work with some amazing legends, Pet Shop Boys, Seal, etc. And then you get fired, and then immediately after recover quickly and go to work with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, who obviously working with Elvis Costello, Morrissey, I think Bush. So these great.
That's right. Yeah, that's, of course. Yeah, it was the Bush session. They were actually called Future Primitive at the time, and then the name evolved to Bush.
Right. So you had, at this point, it sounds like you're probably in your late 20s.
Yeah.
What happens at some point working with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley that you decide that it's time for you to cut the umbilical cord, as you say, and go solo?
Well, it came to me, which was a good thing, because I might have, again, been somewhere too long. They had that studio. There was another studio there, so there was a turnaround of other producers and artists coming in, and I'd do those sessions quite often as well. They also owned this amazing residential studio called Hook End Manor, which was it's a mixture of things. It goes over years. There's Gothic sections, Tudor sections. It's just an incredible house with the most incredible studio attached to it. So when you're working there, you go down there and you live there, do the project, and you're there maybe for a few months, totally into the album. So I've been going there as well during my time with Alan and Clive, working with themselves, but also with other bands. I've been down there with a lot of different artists over the 2 or 3 years. And then I've been working down there on a Morrissey album, which Steve Lillywhite was producing. Got on well with that crowd. And then Steve had come to do another Morrissey album. And the engineer he'd had beforehand, Chris Dickey, who was lovely and great engineer, for whatever reason couldn't make it. And so Steve called me and said, well, why don't you come and do this album? I said, well, I work here. I can't just do that. So I said, well, go freelance. And I still remember where I was when he was saying it. I was on the phone and thinking, he went, listen, you'll earn more doing this album than you will in the next year of being a residential engineer. So there's no risk, we'll get, and there'll be other things. And so I went, okay, fuck it, here we go, off. So we went off, and then in my first year working with Steve, who was just great fun to work with. I mean, just huge amount of energy, massive party character, and a huge talent in the studio. Just, I think a lot of the things I've learned, which I really felt attached to as techniques and ways of working, came from Steve. But then in our first year, we did loads of great things. I had Morrissey sessions, Bowie sessions, and U2 sessions as my first 3 projects as being a freelancer.
Epic.
So, I mean, it just made life, it was a very fortunate start.
Yeah, I'd say.
And again, really fun sessions. And then later on, I'd come back to work with U2, but this time with Brian Eno. Brian Eno had been a regular at Westside, the same studio. It was near his house. And so he was in there doing lots of sessions. I've been there on quite a few of his sessions, which were great. You know, everyone's so different that you work for. This comes back to what we were saying earlier, and not getting bored and always learning, because every producer has a way of going about things, which is different, and you learn. And Brian, of course, is Brian Eno. You got a lot to learn. You're going to learn a lot.
So it sounds like a lot of your success and a lot of the big moments in your career, you made these decisions instinctively, quickly, without floundering around thinking too hard about them, just because you followed your instincts. Is that inaccurate, would you say?
I'd say following your instincts maybe more than logic sometimes, but I think we're talking about luck and things in this industry. We've had this conversation in the past. There's a whole concoction of things that get you from one stage to the next. You can do all the work in the world and it still doesn't work out. But I think if you work really hard and then you have these opportunities that pop into place, and they don't last, they're not going to wait around for a month for you to make up your mind. They've got an album to make, and there's a lot of other people who want to do it. So those are quite quick decisions to make. And then you look back at these things and think, well, how did you get to there in the first place? Okay, I was working with Steve, and I was getting asked this because Chris Dickey couldn't make the project. So that's how nearly everyone in our business got to the next stage, just by someone else falling over. And it's what happened at Psalm. You only came off Night Reception when someone else either got fired or moved on. So you had to, there was an element of fortune to all these things. But when they happened, you had to utilize it. You can, just run on the fortune. But I think with that was a fundamental, I think, in future career, was going, okay, I'm now stepping out, going freelance.
And that was the beginning of your career
That was the beginning. And then I ended up just being very lucky. I was very busy in the days when engineering, again, was a big part of, the budget. Engineers were specialists. That's what you did. You walk into these huge studios with large band setups, tape machines, all the outboard gear, headphone mixes. Just before you even got into processing sounds, there was a lot to learn. But I'd been through a very rigorous learning process. So I didn't feel intimidated by anywhere I was thrown. I mean, I think I probably did, but the difference is you can mask it. You get used to, you can be that person in control. With Bono actually saying to me, calling me the bombardier. And I was like, why is that? He said, because he said, I know how fucking crazy these sessions are. And you kind of walk up and down. And I said, it is that duck analogy. There's my legs kicking around like mad underneath, freaking out in different ways. It may look calm on top, but there's, permanent sweat going on here. So what were we saying? The luck element, making those decisions and going with it. And that applies to everything going forward. When you have offers of work, is it the right thing to do? Should I do it? I think you'll come unstuck maybe less often going with things than saying no to things. There's things where I wasn't quite sure, but I thought I can think of more reasons why it's not a good thing to not go ahead and do this. So let's just go and see what happens. Also, once you're in a project, you make it your own. Things that might not have seemed like a lot of fun, or once you're in there, you give it everything you have. So that's the other big difference. I think no matter what project you had, once I had it in my hands, I was going to enjoy myself anyhow, because that's what I was doing. And that had all my love and attention for until we finished that.
Well, it sounds like this is a really exciting time in your career. I'm wondering, at what point, working with Steve Lillywhite or Morrissey, when did you become a producer? Because you were an assistant engineer, then an engineer. That's a very technical job. And being a producer is, in a lot of ways, I'm sure it helped your production to have the technical knowledge. That's for sure. But you're thinking in a much more broad-based macro, putting pieces together, solving problems as a producer.
Oh, for sure. But as a producer, again, you almost have to take some of that out of your thinking, because they were quite delineated between the two, and trying to do them both well, especially trying to do the engineering well, is hard when you've got the production head on. When I was on these projects, it wasn't like I was just sitting there waiting to be told to do stuff. I had an involvement in the creativity of the sounds and the processes, and then I'd do a lot of the recording, because the producers I worked with when I was with Steve and Gil Norton for a few years after that were very generous in the amount of work they let me do. So, Gil, they had trust in me. They saw that. So we'd often split a session off. They're obviously the producer and had the final say, but they'd be happy for me to go and do guitars with someone for a while and to make decisions over choosing takes. And they had a belief in your ear, I guess, and also just that you could interact with people, because a lot of the time, with production, it's just trying to get the best out of someone. And that's got nothing to do with technical abilities or anything else. It's just how you interact with another person in the room. And, they trusted me with that. So a lot of the time, the band were quite comfortable with me. So there'd be situations where, okay, they finished the album, but they need some B-sides, as we had in those days, or some alternative versions. And they can't afford to get Steve, Gil, or, insert producer here, whatever major producer they had. And so it's like, would you like to do this? So you kind of step into it through that route. So I'd produce the B-sides, or I'd produce some alternative versions. And then that was going on quite a bit. But the first actual, you're being hired as a producer, I think it was Lucien Grange was the A&R man. Lucien's now the head of the world for Universal. At the time, he was an A&R man at Polydor. And he asked me to do a band called Vent 414. It's a sort of guitar band, guitar pop, getting quite indie, but as the producer. And so that was my title going in. But the thing is, I couldn't hand over engineering because I loved engineering too much. So this whole producer-engineer package was evolving much more at that stage. Worked for record companies because they didn't have to pay for both. But as we're saying, you can't really give everything to looking at levels here, especially in those days where there's so much going on. Now you tend to be doing things sequentially on your laptop, but there where it's like it's all kicking off and you're trying to keep an eye on tape machines and mics and mic leads, and then also have a discussion about the song and keep an eye on the emotions of the artist. And that, it was just too much. So the way I liked to work, which is carried on to this day, is just to have really good assistants who are basically engineers. And I'm happy to take a lot of the mechanical stuff out, so I can still lean in and play with things and have that creative side of the engineering. But I'm not running around finding leads and plugging stuff in. And that time can then be very much applied to the sort of producer head, where you're thinking about the songs, you're thinking about what people are doing, thinking about the sequencing of how you're going to do things, and just basically keeping an overall view on the session that it's all functioning in a certain way and that it's moving in a creative direction you want it to go, and that the artist is getting what they want from this project, making sure they're permanently happy and that you're not veering off too far away from an ideal they might have had as a starting point.
So while you started producing, was there, again, another defining moment or something that let you know that, yes, being a producer is really, over an engineer, is really what I ultimately want to do?
I think just having the control, without wanting to sound like a control freak, all of a sudden the responsibilities step up massively. But I like that. I like having almost too much to deal with. I think that keeps me focused. And also maybe deals with a low attention threshold. But I just really liked being able to fuse all the parts, because often in the past I felt there was a slight conflict in areas between having the producer and the engineer. Because my job as an engineer was almost translational. A producer would talk in terms as to how they wanted it to sound, and I'd have the technical skills to go about that recording in a way that might, get somewhere close to that. Whereas I wasn't having to do that. I was having to just get the sound. I could picture it in my head, and I knew a way to get there, or a way to get to somewhere approximate. There's too many variables to ever get anything exact in this business. But, you know where to go. So it tied things in very nicely for me to be able to think about things, but then have the technical side to be able to put it into shape. And also for the artist, it felt like a closer experience, I think, having just a producer engineer. This has been mentioned to me by artists in the past. In the sense that, again, there was one less stage to have to go through to get to what they were having the conversation, and I was making it with them. And it was much more, rather than speaking to a producer, speaks to an engineer, often used to speak to a programmer as well. We'd have a guy sitting on Pro Tools, a guy engineering, and the producer and the assistant, and maybe even an assistant, all getting paid. I mean, there was just a very different budgetary setup in those days. So it just became, and then it just becomes the way you work. And it now feels so much the norm that I have to imagine what it was like to just be the engineer. I can't almost imagine what it was like. There were times I remember biting my lip thinking, oh, this is not the way forward. But I also was very good at keeping my position. I was being paid to be that producer's engineer and to make whatever they wanted to do happen in some way, whether or not I particularly agreed with it. But again, it's part of the learning. You watch what they do, you see the things which you think, hey, that works. And the things which you think, I don't really get that way of going about stuff. A lot of it was the interaction with people. I'd see people thinking, you're just banging heads, you both want the same thing, but you're just not speaking to each other in the right way. So yeah, that was it. Moving on, you're doing all these various positions. And now I just like having really great engineers. I've been very fortunate to have assistants who've worked up through to become great engineers. There's so much you do together in studios. When I was an engineer, where it's almost like old married couples, yourself and the producer. You're with each other 14 hours a day. When I was working with Patti Smith in New York with Gil, she actually pulled us up and said, I've been watching you guys. It's like an old married couple. You kind of look at each other and then do things where you've obviously communicated something. Or even in the middle of a take, someone will do something and I look at the producer, or the producer would look at me, and we wouldn't say anything, but we both know what the deal is. And so you're thinking ahead of the game. You kind of be getting things ready for the next thing you were doing, even though it hadn't been mentioned. You kind of just knew what the flow was between you. And that's when it works really well for me with assistants, is when they're just really watching the conversation and sort of one step ahead of what you need. I've had assistants in the past, and I'll be talking to the artist and I'll see them go and get a mic and start putting a stand up because we're talking about that. But then the artist will change their mind about something and then they'll pack it down, won't say anything. And I've seen it. I'll acknowledge. I say, okay, I can see you're on top of stuff. But the artist has no idea that someone's keeping that, they're so on top of what they're doing around them. I think that's why a lot of the time I do try and make sure that everyone in a room, gets recognised. There's we've all had plenty of emperors in studios at times in our lives, but everyone is so important, right down to an assistant can do a lot of damage on a session. You have to remember how valuable they are.
Totally. Well, so it sounds like the freedom to kind of use your wherewithal to make creative choices rather than having to use a go-between was particularly attractive to you, and I think
I'll remember that because that's perfectly put. You could have narrowed down what I said to that statement, so well done.
Thank you. Well, so I've seen you work in the studio, and it's clear that your technical knowledge makes it much easier for you to make smart, creative choices about sound, and that's impressive. And I've also watched assistants work, such as Liam on our record, and being quite on top of things. And I guess as an artist, you forget that there's this whole machinery working around you to facilitate you to be the artist. And Absolutely. It's very easy to lose sight of that. So that to me has always been interesting, but it's
so that's a fundamental. I will just say, which and I have this conversation with assistants especially when they're long-term assistants with myself. It is all about the artist. I think that's a problem where sometimes in occasions in production where people forget whose song it is. For me, the artist needs to be in a creative space which is constantly forward moving. You might go down an alley and then come back and go somewhere else creatively, but I would say to assistants, we don't need to know about technicalities that have gone wrong. When something's not working, you occasionally get the type who go, hey, that doesn't work, or that's not, it's like, just keep it to yourself. It doesn't matter. I know it doesn't work. That's why I've marked it in the way it is. But it's not part of that conversation, because that's not a creative conversation. That's just a distraction. So it's about trying to remove all the distractions of the studio, because trust me, there's loads. There's so many things that can go wrong in a studio. And especially in the current age of lack of money to maintain them. things break, but they're not conversations to have. I'm not interested. Just move to the next thing that works and get that to do what you were trying to do. I try and keep the time with artists in the studio just creative time. I don't want them to be watching me edit. There's no fun. You don't grow up as an artist wanting to watch someone type in front of you for 3 hours. I can do that late at night, or I can do it first thing in the morning. But when they're in the room, I just want to get record. You've been with me. I'm not going to sit there having you watch me vocal comp or edit drums. It's like, go home, be great for tomorrow. But when you're playing stuff or you're singing stuff, and it's keeping that flow going, which is what gives us the long hours as engineers, producers, and assistants. Is because it's all the crap before and after a session. I say crap, it's not. It's the stuff I love. It's like Tetris. You sit there slotting all the bits together.
That makes sense. I could see why you would like that. So I want to investigate there's obviously a record you produced at somewhere along the lines that kind of changed the calculus from you being fledgling new record producer to like, this guy means business. What record is that?
I think I did an album with a band called 13 Senses, which I think for the label, it worked with their songs. It conveyed them. They were a young band. I got them through the whole sort of studio experience. We had a lot of fun doing the recording, and came out with songs. I mean, and again, this is something else which is very important to me in the list of achievements on a record, is that the artist loves their record. That to me is the most important thing above everything. I'd rather have an A&R guy screaming to me saying he hates something, but the artist is in love with it, than the other way around. Because you live with it forever. You might, as an artist, only do 2 albums, and they are with you for the rest of your life. So you need to have something you can stand behind and say, you love. And I think when I finished the albums with those guys, we're at a point where I kind of delivered that to different artists. People were happy. The artist was saying the right thing. There wasn't an artist coming out going, I didn't like that process. They were enjoying the records they were making. And it was a real mixed bunch as well. I was working with quite a different range of artists, which I wanted as well, because you need to be pulled in different directions to learn what you do best and what you can learn in different ways. I think that was the most complete project I did at that time with regards to production, because it had everything going on. It was a band, it had strings, it had programming, it was a big, full, but great songs, very beautiful melodic songs. But we had the opportunity and the budget to really throw a lot of production things at it. And so it was fun for that.
And then, so after you produced that, at some point, you then get, to my understanding, perhaps your biggest success as a producer, which is producing Coldplay X and Y. So is that connected?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot between those 2 points.
Okay, well, let's get into that. So I would love to hear what bridged the gap, because once you're producing X and Y, to my understanding, I mean, I was a kid when that record came out, and I was like, holy shit, what the fuck is this? And even to this day, I listen back to it, and I'm like, this is an amazing, monumental album for me as an artist. Imagine how surreal it was when I walked into the room and you were like, yeah, well, I remember Chris singing into this mic, and it's wild. So yeah, I'm interested in that journey to get to that place.
Well, I think, we've talked about, or you mentioned about luck in this industry and stuff. That whole thing of, I think I've always been aware and appreciated the luck side of any industry. I'm sure you'll know him, but with Nassim Taleb when he wrote Black Swan back in the day, and this thing about how there's a lot of high flyers in all industries who just don't appreciate how lucky they were. It's very much the ego rides over that. I've seen so many people who are really great at this job, but for whatever reason, it hasn't taken them forwards. And so there were circumstances, again, which between these points take you to that album, for instance, which might be the one which you then become better known for. But it's a case of utilizing and going with those opportunities. That luck pops up, but you have to go with it. And I actually met Coldplay before that, because I'd done mixing on Rush of Blood. And that came about because I'd done other engineering. I was doing a lot of mixing as well at the time. I was producing, and I'd mix stuff and come in as a sort of engineer to help finish and then mix projects with Ken Nelson, who was working with Coldplay. And The other person who worked with Coldplay was a guy, Mark Fithian, who I knew from all kinds of sessions, going back to a band called Cast, and projects in New York. And they were working with Coldplay. So when they then got into a bit of a stick with mixing on Rush of Blood, I had a call to come in and help on that. And so that introduced you to the band, which is, one thing, it's great. I loved working on that project. Again, just people who are very driven, motivated, really know what they want, very particular. And so that was that introduction. So that was a kind of fortunate thing through knowing those guys. And then with regards to producing that, and that being a lucky opportunity, I think I'd come in to actually do some mixing on it. That's how that worked. And then, but it wasn't felt that they really were in the right place with the songs at that point. Was it a step on from Rush of Blood? And so it kind of, I didn't actually carry on mixing. We stopped because they felt they were doing more work. And then I'd gotten a call from Chris. I remember it being one of those real up and down nights, in the sense that him saying, "Look, Dad, I'm not sure that you're going to mix this. They had this American guy, I think, mixed their first album,
Michael Brower."
And I remember trying to be all jolly on the phone, like, hey, life doesn't, that's the way things are. But at the same time, being utterly broken that I wasn't going to mix it because I'd loved mixing the previous one so much. And then he said, "Well, but do you fancy having a go at producing something?" And it was like, so you can imagine that roller coaster of a phone call. You're in the bottom part and now you're in that upper trajectory to, I was like, fuck yeah. And so that again was just, these circumstances. And then the first couple of tracks I went in to do, it worked out well. They liked the way they were going, and they liked, and so it just crept on from there. So yeah, that was it was fortunate in the sense that whatever hadn't worked out at one point gave you an opportunity to come in. But that's the way it is for everyone, in this business. If someone else isn't doing a project, you get your moment to shine, and you just have to make sure you do when you have that opportunity. But I'm the first person to say that luck plays a big part in all our lives in this. I know people who are genuinely great, but just didn't have that opportunity. I was thinking this actually with songwriters. We were talking about great songs. I was just wondering, I wonder how many great artists, maybe all the great ones do bubble to the top, but how many just through misfortune or ended up just not doing this as a career, but in fact they were brilliant people in there. They've got to be out there. It's just the way it works as a system.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But one of the things I was going to cut you off when you were saying before, because I just don't accept that, is surely you were lucky. You got access to incredible opportunities. But I think what needs to be said is that you capitalized and that your work speaks for itself. So like once you mix Rush of Blood to the Head, well, obviously you did a job on that record that, listen, I can listen to The Scientist today.
People don't know the backstory when they hear these things. We're having this story. So no, it has to be a meritocracy in the sense that the people that employ you for the next thing, they don't know the story from before, and they only know what they're hearing. So you're only as good as that, as the outcome of those projects, So yes, I'm not playing down the fact that, you do your best to try and do something well. And that is a defining factor on moving forward and having growth in this industry. But there is an element of, opportunity, shall we say, that, shows its face.
No, totally. Well, obviously there must have been insane expectations for you to deliver on X and Y, and obviously you did.
That was, there's a whole load of things. Album 3, which, before you even walk into the room, is always going to be the difficult child. It's just the way it works. You've done one, you've had another one which has expanded upon your success, and then what do you do? More of the same, or do you go off somewhere else? Whereupon you're going to piss someone off straight away. The fans that want you to be the same person for the rest of their lives, which is everybody. Or I always say bands, the reason they move on, they have different producers, they evolve. Why would they want to do the same thing forever? There are some bands that have done that, and great, it's what they do, and it's what they love, and it's what their fans like. But most creatives want to evolve in some way. I've been very lucky to do 2 albums with lots of people, which I'm always very pleased with. And people say, aren't you sad when you don't do it? It's like, well, no, I'm just pleased to have done 2. To me, that's, it says enough for myself, I think, that I've actually managed to not, get kicked off after the first one. But I totally understand why bands then want to go on and move on and try different things.
Totally.
That doesn't mean that you can on your next album.
Well, that's a good segue. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I I'm very excited that People Say will be released in its entirety. And, for me, you talked a lot in this podcast about your journey and who you learned from and, learning under Steve Lillywhite and Gil Norton. And, we didn't talk much about it, but Phil Spector and all the Alan Winstanley and all these incredible, juggernauts, these incredible people. And when you were saying all those things, well, it's like, I got to learn under you who learned under those people. And so, obviously I'm the artist, but, obviously I'm a very inquisitive mind, and I pay attention.
Oh, that's a big part of what I loved, when we worked together. It was because it was a small setup. It was basically you and myself. Okay, we had support from an assistant, and we brought people in for different parts. But that's what made it a really fun project to me. You being a sort of multi-instrumentalist, so you could have a very clear vision of your songs. But I don't think we could have done that album in the time scale without just that focus of the two of us being in there. There was nothing to distract. We were just at it from dawn till dusk. It chose a strange year to be born, obviously, but it's now coming to its time. I'm just looking forward to seeing it as one solid bit of vinyl with all of those tracks on there. And we got people on there who I've worked with in the past, so that was fun as well. Stell, who you've interviewed on here.
Yes.
Was part of Star Sailor, which was, again, a kind of opportunity for me, in the sense that, it was quite a bizarre scenario because I was working there for Phil Spector at the time. We know what he did. He shot someone in the face, which he already actually kind of moved on from producing the record at that point, but it was still only a matter of weeks afterwards that happened. So again, that was a project which, had plenty going on to deal with outside of just a normal production. That was quite a story, to say the least. But then be able to get people who you've met on those sessions back in on yours, so I just felt would be appropriate. It was like this really lovely opportunity to, mix one of my favorite bass players with one of my favorite drummers on your project as a first of having them both together, and having for a number of years thought, I wonder what they'd be like together, because they're both just they both have such a way of doing things. Plus they loved your project, so it was great.
It was awesome. And I think one of the things that always sticks out to me is that I've always had this preconceived notion about what making records is. You see the Beatles in the studio and Abbey Road and all these things growing up. And when I came into the music industry in this, very technologically advanced time, you make music in someone's apartment. You make music in someone's teeny little studio. So for me to get a chance to make my debut record with the live strings in the big room, in
a classic studio with the most unbelievable gear. We were on a classic desk there.
It was a dream. It was a dream for me, really. I look back on it now, and I was just thinking this recently. I hopefully will make tons of records in my career. I hope I can just continue making records for the rest of my life.
That's a given,
But you only get one first, and it was truly special. So I lots of gratitude and thanks to you for showing me the ropes.
Well, when we first met and what we talked about in the style of music, the songs you're writing, the way you are as a person, it was just like, well, here was actually an opportunity to make records as we did 20 years ago almost, but with all the tech and convenience of now. It just, because the songs felt so classic. They felt like songs you'd known, all your life. So doing it in that way, in a beautiful old-fashioned recording studio with a vintage desk of absolutely exquisite properties, having great string arranger in Audrey, and it all coming together and the songs just flowering, really. Also, I love the time over at my studio at Strong Room. That was brilliant. Doing all the backing vocals and vocals there was so much fun.
It was brilliant, man. I loved it. It was an amazing time. It was an amazing journey, and I know my record's just a small footnote in your career, but it was obviously, for me, an incredibly special time.
You know what? There's nothing. Well, no record. It's a really high-ranking record, actually, in my journey.
Wow. As
to how I feel about it. You don't come out of a project not liking something because you put so much love and effort into it. But that was one which just ticked a lot of boxes, and also just when I see the feedback it gets from my home life, we all like different types of music, but when you see everyone in your family engage with a record, there's something right about it.
Well, that's incredibly humbling to hear, man, for real. Well, it was a pleasure for me. So let's just recap, okay? Let's just go through your story. I'm gonna spark notes your story in like one sentence. So you start your career at SARM, get pummeled for 3 years, working hard, meeting these incredible artists, and then you move on to Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley and work with even more great artists, perhaps in a different side of the engineering production world. And then you get the balls to go freelance and work with Steve Lillywhite, with Bowie and U2 and all these incredible acts. And then you decide to then go really truly freelance when you start producing records on your own. And, culminates, well, not culminates because you're still going, but you work with great acts, Star Sailor, Elbow, just incredible acts. And then you produced X and Y, one of my favorite Coldplay records, and continue to produce legendary albums up until basically now when you produced my record, People Say. So to wrap your career up and sum it up with a couple thoughts is that at every turn, you recognized an opportunity, seized it, and delivered, and you worked really hard. And I think for those listening, the great lesson is just how hard you worked these entire years that we're talking about. There was never a relaxing period where you didn't work your ass off. And I think that is really worth a lot. And I think it's worth mentioning here because so many people listening to this are trying to understand how we get here. And I think your story speaks for itself insofar as you earned it. Even if you were lucky and got great opportunities, you definitely deserve to be here and earned it more than a lot of other people that I've seen based on just how hard you're willing to work.
That's very kind. I've definitely put the hours in but again, this comes back to what we were saying. When you love your job enough, you can do these hours. You don't want to. It's definitely work because you kill yourself doing it. But those hours fly past. When friends outside of our industry, because I do Mondays to Fridays, 10 till midnight. Sounds insane if you work in an office because they envisage doing their job for 14 hours a day. But when it's our job and it's so kind of absorbing and engrossing, those hours literally fly by. It's not a case of I'm looking there going, oh God, when's it going to be 2 o'clock or when's it going to be midnight? It's 2 o'clock or midnight because I looked at the clock at 6 o'clock and then looked up again at midnight and went, fuck, it's midnight. Where did that go? You're so absorbed in what you're doing. And also, it's just, it seems talking to you tonight, actually, it does give me a sense of the journey, which I haven't really thought about as intently as tonight. But it's still very much ongoing to me. I still feel like, there's loads of things I want to do. There's plenty of things to achieve. And there's a lot of technology which isn't even here yet that will be amazing us in 5-10 years' time. And we'll be spending way too many hours in the day fiddling around with them.
Well, it's inspiring to hear that after all this time, you're still so motivated and inspired. And I actually kind of leads me to some other kind of closing questions I have, which is when you look back on your career and everything you've achieved, do you feel like you've achieved everything you wanted to achieve? Do you feel like you've reached your dreams?
No, I wouldn't say no to that in any way that belittles any of the things I've done. It's just I wouldn't like to think I've achieved everything at any particular point. The whole journey for me is something that there's always more to do and to do better and to do differently. I definitely haven't, there's so many boxes to tick. I've really enjoyed the ones I have done. And a lot of those, there's a shared joy. So obviously a project, does well. But no, I definitely don't feel that, I'm not sure whether it's a summit as such that you're aiming for, or just to make sure if I can keep on enjoying it and learning it, and learning things and meeting new artists that amaze me with what they do, then I think that will be the kind of content part. I'm not trying to achieve, when I think about it, an end goal, which I can describe. It's just, can I constantly be kept interested, kept motivated, and kept inspired by the people I work with? Because it's artists that drive you. They are everything. And it's, I've always seen it as very much a privilege that they're trusting you to work with them. It's never anything that's an earned right. It's just it doesn't matter whether it's a very large budget or, fuck all. They're still passing over their baby. And I don't look at a project with no money any differently to a project with a lot of money. It's very much, was trying to explain this in an era when things got quite difficult with money for the industry. There was, comments where, look, actually, if you do that project, just do it quickly because, there's no money there. And it's like, I can't. If I'm doing a project, I'm just doing the project. There's not a way to do it differently to the way I do it because that's how that's what I do. I don't think, how do you do any aspect of what we do a little less? I mean, I don't know how you even do that. You're either totally involved into it or you're not. There's nothing halfway in between. And I think if you keep that attitude up and don't ever realize the importance of every single project, you never know where it's going to go.
True. That's true. And so, which leads me then to my next question, which is when you look back where you started, when you trace back these crazy lines, did you ever imagine you'd be where you are now?
No. And I'm glad about that. I think it would be very sad in life if there really was like a path you could see. I think half the joy is this meandering journey that takes you to places you wouldn't expect to be, And I think that's a big thing that our career, this job of production offers, is the fact there isn't really, an end. You're not looking to be the CEO or you're not, looking to end up in the boardroom. It's just a case of learning constantly whilst moving forward. So do I look back and think, this is, would I ever guess I'd be here? No. But then I wouldn't expect to either.
Wow. So, given all of this in mind now, especially what you said that you don't feel like you've arrived at the summit. You're just wanting to keep learning. So, what's next for you?
Well, the industry's changing. What's happened over the last few years has been a lot more travel. Again, it was these things where you get sparked by an interest. It was like, well, this is a worldwide business. Why am I doing it in London all the time? There's amazing people everywhere. And so it started off first by being invited to a conference and seeing loads of bands showcase. And seeing, you see two bands, you think, they're amazing. I want to work with them. How do we figure this out? And then my management office, you speak about these bands and they made it work. So you could go off to these different places and do a project. And it enabled these bands as well, help them move forward in what they were doing. It started off, I was in Israel, but the last few years I've been sort of in Slovenia, Slovakia, Cuba, South America, mainly Colombia. And I've been really enjoying that. So again, because you just learn stuff the whole time. Honestly, you go to Colombia, I thought there was salsa. They have so many varieties of salsa where if you've grown up with it, do I do salsa music? No, I don't. But there's something about doing a session where that drummer in his other day job plays in a salsa band. There's little feel to stuff. And so all these things, again, are adding to that learning curve, never stopping. There's a real thing about the geography of where you work and that geography coming across in the way the musicians are. I've been enjoying that a lot. So I want to keep that going once we get out of COVID. This, for me, being a year of not traveling, has felt very strange. So I've been working, again, you get to work in great studios with new artists in different parts of the world. I'd like to keep on doing that. I'm actually doing a project with an established artist in China at the moment. I should have been in Beijing, but now we're having to do it virtually. So you can get engrossed in all those aspects of an album that you can do remotely like this. But I realize how important the sort of interpersonal part of making a record is for me. I love being around artists making music. And to say that, I just do it remotely, it's a very different process for me. Because I tend to feed back off things people are doing. And it might not be things they're saying. It might be things that you can tell they're hinting at from, or just the way they behave in a studio. When you spend all your life watching people record, you kind of know when they're comfortable or not and whether things are going the right way. So I hope we're back to being able to travel very quickly. And then you see what the industry does, what new things turn up, what new musical styles pop up on the horizon. Take it from there.
Listen, dude, you've got you just lived a crazy life, man. To this point, and you're still going. It's just wild. And, as a young musician, when you look at other people around you who you work with and you see their journey and their story, it only makes you the more excited that you're only at the beginning of yours.
And that's quite enviable as well. I get excited seeing, you've got all these things to do ahead. You're saying about how many albums you're going to make. You're in a great position.
I feel good, man. And as always, man, it's just such a pleasure to chat with you. And, I think when you make a record with somebody, you have a bond for life. So
it's been a lot of fun. And also, it's interesting. You don't often get a chance to look back at the things you've done. So even just talking about it tonight has brought back some nice memories.
Well, it was my pleasure to listen and to ask questions that genuinely intrigue me. Thank you so much for being on. I appreciate you.
It's been a real pleasure, Ben. Thanks very much indeed, man.
You've just listened to an episode of my podcast, People Say. Thanks for tuning in, and look out for more episodes soon.